This video is about how to expand proportion from the designer's sketch to human scale. It's the challenge of the draper or technician to translate the proportions in the designer's sketch to the proportions on the human body. The first thing to do when analyzing a designer's sketch is I like to draw a center line from the neck hollow that the designer has drawn here through the center down through the center of the torso. You can see with a little bit of designer license that it doesn't line up perfectly, but that's all right. We can also see from the designer's sketch that this figure is standing in a very natural, sort of slightly off balance stance. So that's just fine. Then I like to start on the top, from the waist to the shoulder, or in this case, from the waist to that hollow at the center front of the neck that the designer has indicated. From the neck to the waist is a measurement we normally take on the actor, and we can easily find that on the mannequin when we're starting to drape. So let's look at these proportions. From the neck to the neckline, where the collar comes to a point here, this space that is on the bodice, and then from the upper point on this midriff section to the waist. Let's figure those proportions out. Using the ruler, I can see that it's very nearly 1.5 inches on the ruler. That's very handy because on the 1.5 inches, we can break that up into what I call units. In this case, it would be 1/4 inch. So there's 1 unit, 2 units, 3, 4, 5, and 6 units. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 units. So if 1/4 inch is a unit, how far from the neck hollow to where the neckline sits? Well, that's about 2 units. From where the neckline comes to its point, this space between the neckline and the top of the midriff is about 1 unit. And then from the top of the point on that midriff to the waist is 1, 2, 3 units, which adds up to our 6 units. So what does that mean? Let's go to the mannequin and find out. The next step is to divide the neck to waist on the mannequin into the same 6 units as we divided the designer's sketch. In this case, the math works out to be about 2.5 inches. Next, let's analyze the skirt yoke, this hip yoke here. Using the same unit, the 1/4 inch equals 1 unit, how far from the waist to this skirt yoke point are we? Let's count. 1 unit, 2, 3 units. So that is a 3 units point from 3 units from the waist to the point. Now this yoke curves up on the hip. So what is the proportion, using our units again, from the waist to the side of the yoke? Let's count that. 1, 2 units. So we have 2 units at the side seam and 3 units at the center front. Let's go to the mannequin and see how that proportions out. Referring to the designer's sketch, we know that the neck to where the collar or neckline comes to a point is 2 units. So that would be 2 units times 2.5, which is 5 inches. So the collar here will come to about 5 inches below the neck. Referring again to the designer's sketch, this next proportion is 1 unit, and so that's about 2.5 inches. And I'm putting a straight pin in just to mark these. Then, from there to the waist, it is 3 units, which in this case is about 7 and a little bit. So there we have, here's the collar, here is the bodice, here is the midriff point coming up to here. So this marks from the neck to where the collar comes to, the neckline, and the bodice, and then the midriff point here. Next, let's apply those same units to the side seam. Where does the line from that center front point here, where does it go to on the side seam? Measuring on the designer's sketch, it goes to about 2.5 inches up from the waist, or that 1 unit. So next, I like to use 1/4 inch black twill tape to sort of rough in the lines that the designer has in the sketch. Trying to maintain, not an absolute straight line, because that is not what the designer drew, but a delicate curve to that neckline down to the point and then back up again. And we'll just test our proportions in this way, in this very graphic way. Black twill tape on the ivory muslin linen of the dress form. So there's that neckline. Next, we will pin in this line from the center front, under the bust, to the side seam. Now this is where a little artistic judgment comes in. Depending on where the cup of the breast is sitting on your particular client, it will dictate where this seam needs to go. It needs to fit underneath that breast, and you can always check that measurement, the shoulder to apex measurement that we always take, to see where the curve of that is, so that this line isn't cutting into that breast. We want to be able to just gracefully slide past the bosom that way. Something like that. You want to be careful about lines that go around the body. Lines that go directly horizontal around the body tend to appear less graceful than a line that continues down like this. To avoid getting too small at the back, what that might mean is that you may need to move this up a little bit at the side in order to be able to continue that graceful dip down to center back. Now, at center back, we do want that to be at a 90-degree angle, perfectly meeting itself as it continues around. We don't want that to be at a V, because that's not what the designer drew. Next, let's apply the units from the designer's sketch to the mannequin. And it was 3 units at center front to find where the tip of this hip yoke is. And it was 2 units at the side seam to where the hip yoke goes here. So that's that. And let's sketch that in with our 1/4 inch twill tape and see how that looks. Now, thinking back to the designer's sketch, it was a very idealized, very elongated, long, elegant 1930s silhouette, which may or may not be the same silhouette as your client or the actor. And so we may need to adapt some of these proportions to make your actor look as lovely as the sketch. You may need to put some straight pins in along these curves so that they don't slide around later when we are draping them. Depending on how curved this is, which of course is dependent on the breast and how it sits, you may, or your designer may choose to soften that center front line, or keep it accentuated as it is in the sketch. That's just a dialogue between you and your designer, and then of course taking in the reality of your client